this didn't happen overnight. The Directorate General of Foreign Trade first floated this idea over a year ago with one goal: use e-commerce as an export engine. But the real accelerant? Tariffs. In August 2025, the United States imposed a steep 50% tariff on Indian goods that hits small exporters hardest. In response, the Indian government quietly formed a working group, industry and bureaucrats in the same room to find new export channels and cushion the blow. Hi, this is Indraneel and welcome to the Spotlight Beyond Profession, Beyond Borders, Beyond Headlines. Here are the facts. Their homework included the hard questions. How do you carve out exports without opening the back door to full B2C liberalization? How do you strictly separate export inventory from domestic inventory? What's the pilot roadmap? And here's a fact that matters for governance watcher: this decision did not need cabinet approval. It moved through the DPIIT as an executive policy note even though it was discussed at the cabinet level. That's a signal of how India is increasingly using administrative agility, not legislative overhaul, to move trade policy. The fine print, the actual safeguards, is still coming. DGFT is expected to release detailed rules in a few weeks. Full operational rollout, officials estimate 4 to 5 months. Let's ground this in data because numbers cut through spin. India's merchandise exports rose 15.5% year-on-year to $40.41 billion in June. For the April to June quarter of this fiscal year, exports touched $129.32 billion. But here's the number that explains why this policy exists. India's e-commerce exports, the special segment this policy targets, are estimated at just $4 to $5 billion annually. A rounding error against the country's total trade ambition. And the ambition is explicit. Amazon has publicly tied this reform to India's target of $80 billion in cumulative e-commerce exports by 2030. Who stands to gain the most? Roughly 70% of India's active e-commerce linked SMEs in fashion and apparel, gems and jewelry, home and living, organic wellness, beauty and handcraft, lifestyle goods. These are the artisans, Tier 2 and Tier 3 manufacturers who have never had a direct capital-backed channel to global shelves. Amazon's own statement calls this is an amendment that empowers Tier 2 and Tier 3 manufacturers to go global. Now here's where we go beyond the headline. Because at the Spotlight, we don't just report policy, we decode its socio-economic architecture. This is fundamentally a governance balancing act. India is trying to do three things simultaneously: attract global capital into manufacturing and export infrastructure, protect the domestic retail ecosystem, the kirana stores, the small sellers, from being steamrolled by inventory-owning giants, respond to external shocks, tariff, without triggering a domestic political backlash. That's not a small needle to thread. And it's precisely the kind of policy tension ESG-conscious investors and institutions should be watching, because trade policy is now inseparable from industrial equity. Who gets access to capital and who gets left in the informal economy is a governance question as much as an economic one. Industry voices are already flagging the real test: demarcation. How do you legally and operationally separate exports-only inventory from domestic inventory inside the same company? Without airtight rules, this becomes a loophole, not a lever. One Export Promotion Council representative put it plainly. The real question is whether the government can enforce that line at all. And the geopolitical timing isn't neutral either. This lands in the middle of active India-US trade talks with fresh American tariffs expected imminently. That context matters. Policy neutrality on paper doesn't erase strategic intent underneath it. Our view: this is a calculated narrow opening, not a liberalization. It's a pressure valve for export competitiveness engineered specifically to avoid disturbing India's $100 billion plus domestic retail and marketplace ecosystem. Whether it stays that narrow will depend entirely on the safeguard DGFT publishes in the coming weeks. Industry reactions has been layered, not uniform. A senior e-commerce executive told reporters this move has no meaningful impact on the domestic e-commerce landscape precisely because it's export exclusive. The upside in this word is a new channel for India's made products to reach global consumers, not a disruption of Amazon, Flipkart or Meesho's existing domestic playbook. A second executive called it a positive step for India's export ecosystem and domestic manufacturers, but was careful to frame it as export facilitation, not a broader e-commerce policy shift. Meanwhile, export promotion councils are asking the harder operational question: how exactly will demarcation be enforced? That's not skepticism for its own sake. It's the difference between a policy that works and one that gets gamed. So here's the bottom line, stripped of noise. India hasn't opened its e-commerce market. It's opened an export lane, narrow, controlled, and built specifically for the moment global tariffs are squeezing its small manufacturers. The real story isn't Thursday's press note. It is the next few months when DGFT's safeguards land, when the pilot begins, and when we find out whether export only actually stays that way. That's the difference between policy on paper and policy in practice, and that's why we will be watching. This is a Spotlight Beyond Profession, where we go beyond headlines, beyond borders, and beyond the press release. Subscribe, follow the Spotlight Media and Technology and the Spotlight Beyond Profession across platforms, and stay with us because the next policy shift is always closer than it looks. Thank you very much for watching and signing it off.